In a forgotten village on the border between Romania and Hungary, there exists a family that scientists refuse to study. A family whose very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about human genetics and the nature of consciousness itself. On a stormy night in October 2016, two identical twin brothers married two identical twin sisters in a ceremony that the local priest later said felt cursed from the moment he began speaking the vows. The couples built their lives together, had children together, raised those children in what seemed like perfect harmony. But when those children turned 5 years old and started speaking in perfect unison, completing each other's thoughts before the words were spoken, experiencing each other's pain across miles of distance, the parents realized they had created something that should not exist. The genetic testing that followed revealed a truth so disturbing that 3 different laboratories refused to publish the results, and the lead geneticist who analyzed the children's DNA quit his position, stating only that some doors should never be opened, some combinations should never be created, and that what he saw in those children's genetic code looked less like a family tree and more like a trap, a biological maze with no exit where individual identity goes to die. If you're obsessed with genetic mysteries that defy explanation, with stories about families who accidentally create something that blurs the line between human and something else entirely, with folklore that turns out to be a warning we should have heeded, then you need to subscribe immediately and turn on all notifications, because we dive deep into the darkest corners of human genetics, where science and superstition collide. Hit that like button if you're brave enough to hear what happens when nature's rules are broken. And drop a comment telling me if you think these children are blessed or cursed. Because by the end of this story, you won't be sure anymore. Now, let's enter a world where twin bloodlines don't just merge, but create something that geneticists are calling either the future of human evolution or humanity's greatest mistake. The village is called Săpânța, a place known throughout Eastern Europe for its peculiar cemetery where tombstones are carved with darkly humorous epitaphs and painted in bright colors. A place where death is treated not as an ending, but as a transformation. But the village has another, darker reputation that locals don't share with tourists. Săpânța has the highest rate of twin births in all of Europe, a statistical anomaly that has persisted for at least 3 centuries according to church records. Some geneticists have theorized that the isolated population developed a genetic predisposition for twinning. Others whisper about something in the water, something in the soil, some environmental factor that increases the likelihood of eggs splitting or multiple ovulations. But the oldest residents of Săpânța tell a different story, a folklore that speaks of an ancient bargain made by the village founders, a deal that brought prosperity and protection, but at the cost of producing children who exist between worlds, children who are never quite singular, never quite whole in the way that normal humans are whole. The twin brothers were named Andrei and Vasil Russo, born on the winter solstice in 1988, during a blizzard so severe that the midwife almost didn't make it to their mother's house in time. The midwife, an old woman named Mariska, who had delivered hundreds of babies in Săpânța over her 60-year career, later told people that the moment she saw the twins, she felt a deep unease, though she couldn't explain why. The boys were perfectly healthy, identical in every visible way. But Mariska said there was something about the way they looked at each other, even as newborns, that suggested they were communicating in a language older than words. The twin sisters were named Raluca and Simona Dumitru, born on the summer solstice in 1990, and their birth was attended by the same Mariska, who by then was old enough that she should have retired but continued working because, as she said, someone had to keep count. Someone had to remember the patterns. When Mariska delivered Raluca and Simona, she made a note in her personal journal, a journal that would later be examined by researchers trying to understand what happened in Săpânța. She wrote, "Another solstice pair. The balance tilts further. The old ones were right to be afraid. Andrei and Vasil grew up in a household that was loving but marked by strangeness that their parents tried to ignore. The boys didn't just finish each other's sentences. They would sometimes speak in alternating words, creating sentences that flowed between them as if they shared a single mouth. They never fought, never disagreed, never showed any signs of the normal sibling rivalry that even regular twins usually experience. Their parents took them to doctors in Budapest who found nothing physically wrong but recommended psychological evaluation. The psychologist who examined the boys wrote in her report that she had never encountered children with such a profound sense of shared identity, and that she wasn't sure if this was a problem that needed fixing or simply an extreme expression of normal twin bonding. Raluca and Simona showed the same patterns, perhaps even more intensely. Their parents would sometimes find them sleeping in the same crib, even though they had separate cribs, arranged in the same position, breathing in perfect synchronization. As they learned to walk, they would move in mirrored patterns, as if choreographed. When one fell and hurt herself, the other would cry with the same intensity despite being uninjured. Their parents consulted Mariska, who had delivered them, and the old midwife said something that the parents would never forget. Solstice twins are always connected to something larger than themselves. What they share is not just blood but a doorway, and sometimes things can pass through that doorway in both directions. The 4 children attended the same village school, and it was inevitable that they would find each other. Andrei and Raluca became inseparable first, when they were about 12 years old, drawn together by something that neither could articulate but both recognized. Within months, Vasil and Simona had also paired off, and the 4 of them formed a tight unit that excluded almost everyone else. Teachers noticed that the 4 would sometimes answer questions in a round-robin fashion, each speaking a few words of an answer, as if they were reading from the same script. Other students found them unsettling and tended to avoid them, which only pushed the 4 closer together. By the time they were teenagers, Andrei, Vasil, Raluca, and Simona had become the subject of village gossip. Old women would make warning signs when they passed, muttering prayers under their breath. The village priest, Father Iosif, tried to counsel the 4 young people, warning them that their closeness was unhealthy, that they needed to develop relationships outside their group. But the 4 ignored this advice, and their bond only deepened as they moved into young adulthood. They announced their intention to have a double wedding when Andrei and Vasil were 28 and Raluca and Simona were 26. The village reacted with a mixture of excitement and dread. On one hand, twin weddings were considered auspicious in Săpânța, a cause for celebration. On the other hand, the older residents remembered stories about what could happen when twins married twins. Stories that were usually dismissed as superstition, but which held a kernel of warning that had been passed down for generations. Mariska, now 93 years old and failing in health, asked to speak with the 4 young people before the wedding. In her cottage filled with herbs and old medical equipment, she told them a story that she had heard from her grandmother, who had heard it from her grandmother, going back through the generations. She told them about a pair of twin brothers who had married twin sisters in Săpânța in the year 1847, and about the children that had resulted from that union. Those children, Mariska said, had been beautiful and brilliant, but they had also been wrong in some fundamental way that nobody could quite define. They couldn't bear to be separated from each other, not even for a few hours. They spoke in voices that harmonized in ways that sounded unnatural. They seemed to know things they had no way of knowing, particularly about each other, as if they could see through each other's eyes and feel through each other's skin. Those children from 1847, Mariska said, had lived until they were 23 years old, and then they had died on the same night, despite being in different locations and having no apparent illness. They had simply stopped living, as if the force that animated them had been withdrawn all at once. Mariska told the four young people that she was sharing this story not to stop them from marrying, but to make them aware that if they had children, those children might be special in ways that were both wonderful and terrible, and that they needed to be prepared for that possibility. The four young people thanked Mariska for her concern, but dismissed the story as folklore with no basis in reality. They married in a ceremony in October 2016, a double wedding that the entire village attended, and they built 2 houses side by side on the edge of Săpânța, so close that they could walk between the houses in seconds. They lived communally, sharing resources and responsibilities, and to outsiders they seemed like the happiest people imaginable. Raluca became pregnant first, in the spring of 2017, and within 6 weeks, Simona was also pregnant. The synchronization of their pregnancies seemed almost too perfect to be coincidence, but the village doctor assured them it was simply a matter of the women having similar hormonal cycles, which was common in sisters who lived together. The pregnancies progressed identically, both women experiencing the same symptoms at the same times, gaining weight at the same rate, feeling the first movements of their babies on the same day. They gave birth within 12 hours of each other in January 2018. Raluca delivering a daughter named Mihaela and Simona delivering a daughter named Florina. The babies were so similar that the nurses in the hospital had to check their identification bracelets multiple times to ensure they didn't confuse them. They had the same birth weight within a few grams, the same length, the same unusual violet tint to their eyes that the pediatrician said would probably change to brown as they grew older, but which never actually changed. The families brought the babies home to Săpânța, and for the first few months everything seemed normal, or as normal as anything could be in that unusual household. The 4 parents raised the 2 babies together, often forgetting which baby belonged to which mother because it genuinely didn't seem to matter. The babies fed at the same times, slept at the same times, cried at the same times. When one was fussy, both were fussy. When one was calm, both were calm. The parents found this charming and convenient, never suspecting that what they were seeing was the beginning of something far more profound and disturbing. The first clear sign that something unusual was happening came when the girls were about 6 months old. Mihaela was in the house with Raluca and Andrei, while Florina was next door with Simona and Vasile. Mihaela reached for a red toy and began playing with it, and at the exact same moment, Florina, who could not possibly see or hear what was happening next door, also reached out her hand in the same motion, grasping at air as if reaching for an invisible red toy. The parents noticed this happen several times over the next few days, the girls making identical movements at identical times, despite being in different locations. They mentioned this to the village doctor, who suggested it was simply coincidence, that babies have limited movement patterns and synchronization was bound to happen occasionally. But the parents weren't convinced, and they began watching more carefully. What they observed over the following months confirmed their suspicions that something extraordinary was happening with their daughters. By the time Mihaela and Florina were 1 year old, they had developed a form of communication that went beyond normal infant babbling. They would make sounds in response to each other even when separated by walls, as if having a conversation that the adults couldn't fully hear or understand. When one learned to stand, the other stood on the same day. When one took her first step, the other took her first step within minutes. They learned words at exactly the same pace, and more disturbingly, they sometimes seemed to share vocabulary that only one of them had been exposed to. The parents, now deeply concerned, consulted specialists in child development in Budapest. They brought both girls in for evaluation, and the specialists were fascinated by what they observed. The girls, now 15 months old, demonstrated what the lead psychologist called unprecedented behavioral synchronization. In a controlled experiment, the psychologist separated the girls into different rooms and gave Mihaela a new toy she had never seen before. Within minutes, Florina, in the other room with no possible way of knowing about the toy, began making gestures that seemed to mimic playing with the same object. The psychologist repeated this experiment multiple times with different objects and different activities, always with the same result. What one girl experienced, the other seemed to experience as well. The psychologist recommended genetic testing, explaining that the girls' unusual connection might be related to their unique genetic heritage. Because Andrei and Vasil were identical twins, their sperm carried the same DNA. Because Raluca and Simona were identical twins, their eggs carried the same DNA. This meant that Mihaela and Florina, despite being technically cousins with different parents, were genetically as similar as full siblings, sharing approximately 50% of their DNA, just as any two siblings would. But the geneticist who analyzed the girls' DNA, Dr. Elena Balan, found something that went beyond the expected sibling-level similarity. She found what she called resonance patterns, sections of DNA where the genetic code appeared to be amplified rather than simply inherited. Dr. Balan had never seen anything like it in her 20 years of genetic research. She ran the tests multiple times, sent samples to colleagues in other countries, and every analysis came back with the same disturbing result. The girls' genetic similarity was somehow greater than it should be, as if their DNA had been not just inherited, but intensified by the unique circumstances of their conception. Dr. Balan wrote a detailed report that she sent to the parents along with a request to conduct more extensive studies. In that report, she explained that the girls represented a genetic phenomenon that had never been properly documented before. She theorized that when identical twin brothers marry identical twin sisters and have children, those children don't just share normal sibling genetics, but exist in a state of what she called genetic superposition, where their DNA is so similar that it might affect neurological development in unexpected ways. The most disturbing part of Dr. Balan's report was her speculation about consciousness and identity. She wrote that if the girls' brains were developing in an environment of extreme genetic similarity, and if they were constantly in close proximity during the critical early years of neurological development, it was theoretically possible that their brains might be networking with each other, creating shared neural pathways that crossed the boundary between individuals. She said this was highly speculative and would require extensive neurological testing to confirm, but that the behavioral observations were consistent with this theory. The parents, terrified by these implications, made a decision that they would later come to regret. They decided to separate the girls, to raise them in the two different houses, to limit their contact in hopes of encouraging independent development. They consulted child psychologists who assured them this was the right approach, that children needed to develop individual identities, and that the sooner they established boundaries, the better. The separation began when the girls were 18 months old. Mihaela stayed primarily with Raluca and Andrei in one house, while Florina stayed primarily with Simona and Vasil in the other house. They allowed the girls to play together during the day, but separated them at night and during meals. The parents hoped this would be enough to break the intense connection and allow each girl to develop normally. The experiment lasted exactly 1 week before it became clear that it was not just failing, but was actively harming the children. Both girls stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly, and spent most of their time crying and calling for each other. They would stand at the windows of their respective houses, looking across at the other house, making distressed sounds that broke their parents' hearts. By the end of the week, both girls had developed fevers despite having no infection, and the doctor warned that if the stress continued, there could be serious health consequences. The parents reunited the girls, and the improvement was immediate and dramatic. Within hours, both girls were eating, sleeping, and playing normally again. It was as if the separation had been causing them physical pain that disappeared the moment they were back together. The parents abandoned any further attempts at separation and accepted that Mihaela and Florina would need to be raised as a unit. As the girls grew from toddlers into young children, the phenomenon intensified rather than diminishing, as the parents had hoped. By age 3, Mihaela and Florina had developed a private language that linguists who later studied it described as unlike any known language. It wasn't just the twin language that many twins develop temporarily, which is usually simplified speech patterns. This was something more complex, with its own grammar and vocabulary that seemed to shift and evolve rapidly. The girls would have long conversations in this language, and occasionally they would translate for the adults, explaining that they had been discussing things they had dreamed about, or things they were planning to do. The most unsettling aspect was that the girls' dreams seemed to be synchronized. They would wake up in the morning and describe identical dream scenarios, down to specific details that they couldn't possibly have coordinated. They would say things like, "We dreamed about the red bird again," or "We visited the old woman in the forest," always using we rather than I, always treating their dream experiences as shared rather than individual. By age 5, when most children are developing a strong sense of individual identity and often going through a phase of asserting independence, Mihaela and Florina showed no signs of seeing themselves as separate individuals. They referred to themselves interchangeably, answering to either name, sometimes signing their artwork with both names, sometimes with a symbol they had created that represented both of them together. Teachers at the village kindergarten reported that trying to work with them individually was nearly impossible because if you separated them, both would become distressed and unable to focus. The village of Săpânța, which had initially been charmed by the unusual children, now looked upon them with growing unease. The girls would sometimes say things that they had no way of knowing, describing events that had happened to people they had never met, knowing details about village history that they hadn't been taught. When asked how they knew these things, they would simply say, "We remember," as if they were accessing some kind of collective memory that went beyond their own experiences. Old Mariska, now bedridden and close to death, asked to see the girls one final time. The parents brought Mihaela and Florina to her cottage, and Mariska spent an hour watching the girls play, observing how they moved in synchronized patterns, how they seemed to communicate without speaking, how they operated as parts of a whole rather than as individuals. Finally, Mariska called the 4 parents to her bedside and told them something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. She said that what they were seeing in the girls was what the old folklore had warned about for centuries. She said that in the ancient language that predated even Romanian in that region, there was a word for children like Mihaela and Florina, dvojduša, which roughly translated meant tous, old, or perhaps more accurately shared, sold. According to the oldest traditions, dvojduša were children who existed between the world of singular identity and some other state that normal humans couldn't fully understand. They were considered both blessed and cursed, blessed with a connection that transcended normal human loneliness, but cursed to never exist as complete individuals. Mariska said that the folklore taught that dvojduša needed to be protected because they were vulnerable to forces that normal people weren't vulnerable to. She said that the girls would face challenges as they grew older, particularly during adolescence, when individual identity typically solidifies. She warned that trying to separate them or force them into independent identities could be not just psychologically damaging, but potentially fatal. That the connection between them was not optional, but essential to their survival. The parents asked Mariska if there was any way to help the girls develop more normally, to reduce the intensity of their connection. Mariska shook her head and said that the girls were what they were, that their genetic heritage and their neurological development had created something that couldn't be undone. She said the only thing the parents could do was accept the girls as they were, and protect them from a world that wouldn't understand them. Mariska died 3 days after that conversation, and the village buried her with great ceremony, recognizing that they had lost not just a midwife, but a keeper of knowledge that was rapidly disappearing from the modern world. At her funeral, several older residents spoke about how Mariska had always warned people about the consequences of the village's high twin birth rate, had always kept records of which families had genetic patterns that might lead to dvojduša, had always tried to guide people away from marriages that might produce such children. But people rarely listened to warnings about genetic heritage, especially when love was involved. The families tried to continue raising Mihaela and Florina as normally as possible, but normal was a concept that seemed increasingly irrelevant. By age 7, the girls had developed abilities that seemed to go beyond any reasonable explanation. They could finish each other's thoughts not just in conversation but in written work. If you asked one girl to start writing a story and then switched to the other girl mid-sentence, the story would continue seamlessly as if written by a single author. They could solve puzzles cooperatively in ways that suggested they were sharing visual information that only one of them could physically see. Most disturbingly, they seemed to experience each other's physical sensations. When Mihaela fell and scraped her knee, Florina would cry out in pain at the same moment, even if she was in a different location and couldn't see what had happened. When Florina developed a bad cold, Mihaela would show mild symptoms despite not being infected. The village doctor had no medical explanation for these phenomena, and eventually stopped trying to explain them, simply accepting that the girls were connected in ways that medical science couldn't account for. The parents finally agreed to allow comprehensive scientific study of the girls, participating in research conducted by a team from the University of Cluj-Napoca. The research team included geneticists, neurologists, psychologists, and even a philosopher who specialized in consciousness and identity. They studied the girls intensively for 6 months, conducting brain scans, psychological evaluations, genetic analysis, and behavioral observations. The results of that research were published in a series of academic papers that created controversy in the scientific community. The brain scans showed that when Mihaela and Florina were in close proximity, their neural activity synchronized in patterns that the neurologists had never observed before. Their brain waves would align, showing similar patterns of activity at the same times, as if their brains were coordinating their functions. When separated by significant distances, both girls showed signs of neurological stress, with disrupted brain wave patterns and elevated stress hormone levels. The genetic analysis confirmed Dr. Balan's earlier findings and added new disturbing details. The girls' DNA showed evidence of what the geneticists called epigenetic convergence, where genes that control neurological development had been activated and modified in nearly identical patterns despite the girls having slightly different environmental exposures. It was as if their genetic expression was coordinating itself across the two individuals, creating neurological development that was more similar than normal genetics alone would explain. The psychological evaluation revealed that the girls had effectively no concept of individual identity in the way that normal humans do. When asked to describe themselves, they would always use collective terms, always reference both of them together, always frame their experiences as shared rather than individual. The psychologists tried various interventions to encourage individual identity development, but all of these interventions failed and seemed to cause the girls distress. The philosopher on the research team, Dr. Radu Ionescu, wrote a controversial paper arguing that Mihaela and Florina represented a form of consciousness that philosophy had theorized about but never observed. A distributed consciousness that exists across multiple physical substrates. He argued that trying to force the girls into individual identities would be not just practically impossible, but ethically wrong, as it would be destroying the form of consciousness that they actually possessed in order to make them conform to what society expected. This philosophical argument created heated debate. Some ethicists argued that the girls had a right to develop individual identities, and that their current state was a result of environmental factors that could and should be corrected. Others argued that the girls' form of consciousness was just as valid as normal individual consciousness, and that society needed to accommodate them rather than trying to change them. The debate remained unresolved, and the girls' parents were left to make decisions without clear ethical guidance. As Mihaela and Florina approached their 8th birthday, their younger siblings were born. Both Raluca and Simona had become pregnant again in a continuation of the synchronized pattern that had marked their first pregnancies. This time, Raluca delivered a son named Teodor, and Simona delivered a son named Adrian, born 2 days apart. The parents watched these new babies with a mixture of hope and dread, wondering if Teodor and Adrian would show the same patterns that their sisters had shown. For the first year, Teodor and Adrian seemed to develop more normally than Mihaela and Florina had. They showed typical baby behaviors, normal developmental milestones. No unusual synchronization beyond what might be expected from cousins being raised in close proximity. The parents began to hope that perhaps the phenomenon that had affected the girls was a one-time occurrence, a unique combination of factors that wouldn't repeat. But as the boys approached 18 months old, the synchronization began. They started mimicking each other's movements, responding to each other across distances, showing signs of the same deep connection that the girls had. The parents realized with growing horror that they were going to have 2 pairs of dvojduša, 4 children who existed in a state between individual and merged consciousness, 4 children who would need to be raised together, who might never be able to function independently in normal society. The village of Săpânța, which had always had an uneasy relationship with its own folklore and traditions, now found itself forced to confront the reality that the old stories had been warnings based on observed patterns, not just superstitions. The mayor convened a meeting of village elders to discuss what should be done about the Russo family and the unusual children. Some argued that the family should be encouraged to leave, that their presence was attracting unwanted attention from scientists and journalists. Others argued that the village had a responsibility to protect the family and the children, that this was a Săpânța problem that required a Săpânța solution. Father Iosif, the village priest, took a position that surprised many. He argued that Mihaela, Florina, Teodor, and Adrian were not aberrations or mistakes, but were perhaps examples of human consciousness expressing itself in a form that was rare but not wrong. He said that the church had always taught that the soul was mysterious, and that God's creation was more complex than humans could fully understand. He said that rather than trying to fix or change these children, the village should learn to accommodate them and protect them from a world that would see them as freaks or experimental subjects. The families made the decision to stay in Săpânța, reasoning that the village, with all its strangeness and its history of twins, was the one place where their children might be understood and accepted. They withdrew from further scientific study, refusing requests from researchers around the world who wanted to study the children. They homeschooled all 4 children together, creating an educational environment that accommodated their unusual form of consciousness rather than fighting against it. As Mihaela and Florina moved into their early teenage years, now 13 years old, they have developed into young people who are simultaneously fascinating and unsettling. They are highly intelligent, artistic, and creative, producing collaborative works of art and writing that show sophisticated thought and emotional depth. They have learned to navigate a world that expects individual identity by developing strategies to appear more independent than they actually are, speaking in turns rather than in unison when around outsiders, using singular pronouns even though they still think of themselves collectively, but in private they remain what they have always been, two bodies containing what seems to be a single distributed consciousness, or perhaps two consciousnesses so thoroughly intertwined that the boundary between them has effectively disappeared. They are not unhappy. They insist that they are content with their unusual existence. But they are also aware that they will never have normal lives, never form individual romantic relationships, never have the privacy and autonomy that most people take for granted. Pyotr and Adrian, now 5 years old, are following the same mental path that their sisters followed, showing the same intense synchronization, the same difficulty with individual identity, the same neurological coordination that defies medical explanation. The 4 children together form a kind of family within a family, relating to each other in ways that their parents can observe but never fully understand. Dr. Radu Ionescu, the philosopher who studied the girls, has continued to write about them, arguing in academic papers that they represent a form of human existence that challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness and identity. He suggests that the Western emphasis on individualism has made us unable to recognize or value forms of consciousness that are more collective or distributed. He points to examples from other cultures that recognize and honor states of shared identity, and he argues that Mihaela, Florina, Pyotr, and Adrian should be understood not as medical anomalies, but as natural variations in how human consciousness can manifest. But not everyone agrees with this philosophical perspective. Critics argue that the children are victims of a genetic accident that has robbed them of the possibility of individual selfhood, that they have been denied something fundamental to human experience. Some psychologists argue that with intensive intervention, the children could still develop individual identities, that it's not too late to help them separate and become independent individuals. The families have rejected these interventions, having seen what happened during the brief attempt to separate the girls when they were toddlers. They have accepted that their children are what they are, and they are focused on helping them navigate a world that isn't designed for people like them. They are making plans for the children's futures, plans that assume Mihaela and Florina will need to stay together as adults, that Pyotr and Adrian will need to stay together, that the 4 of them will need to create lives that accommodate their unusual form of consciousness. The genetic mystery of why this happened to these children specifically, why the combination of identical twin parents produced this extreme form of synchronization and shared consciousness, remains unsolved. Dr. Balin's theory about genetic resonance and epigenetic convergence provides a partial explanation, but it doesn't fully account for the neurological phenomena that the children display. Some researchers speculate that there might be additional factors, perhaps environmental influences specific to Săpânța, perhaps unknown genetic variants in the parents' DNA, perhaps even the timing of the children's births relative to the solstice, though that last suggestion is usually dismissed as too folkloric to be taken seriously. What is clear is that when twins marry twins and have children, there is a possibility, rare but real, that those children will be connected in ways that go far beyond normal sibling bonds. The genetic similarity, combined with environmental factors and perhaps neurological development patterns that science doesn't yet fully understand, can create beings who exist in a gray zone between individual and collective consciousness. The question of whether this is a miracle or a nightmare remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. For Mihaela, Florina, Pyotr, and Adrian, it is simply their reality, the only existence they have ever known. They don't experience their merged consciousness as a loss because they have never known what it feels like to be truly separate. They don't mourn their lack of individual identity because they don't conceive of identity the way normal people do. But for their parents, for the scientists who study them, for the village that watches them grow, these children represent a profound challenge to assumptions about what it means to be human. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions about where individual consciousness ends and shared consciousness begins, about whether there are forms of human existence that are fundamentally different from what we consider normal, about whether genetic science has opened doors that should have remained closed. In the folklore of Săpânța, there is an old saying that the villagers still recite at twin births: when two become one, watch for the return. Nobody is quite sure what that saying means or what it refers to, but the oldest residents say it has something to do with the dvojduša, with what happens when twin bloodlines merge so completely that the boundaries between individuals begin to dissolve. Some interpret the saying as a warning, suggesting that the dvojduša are not entirely human anymore, that they have become something that is returning from some ancient past or emerging from some alternate possibility of human development. Others interpret it as a prophecy, suggesting that the dvojduša might be the future of human consciousness, a preview of how humanity might evolve if we continue to break down the barriers between individual minds. As I finish telling this story, Mihaela and Florina are planning their future together, talking about attending university together, studying something that will allow them to work as a team, perhaps art or collaborative writing or some field that values their ability to think and create as a unified consciousness. Teodor and Adrian are in kindergarten, learning to navigate a world that expects them to be separate individuals even though they experience themselves as parts of a larger whole. Families continue to live side by side in Săpânța, raising these extraordinary children, protecting them from exploitation and judgment, trying to give them the best life possible given their unusual nature. The village has learned to accommodate them, to treat them as a unique but accepted part of the community, to protect the family's privacy from the journalists and researchers who still occasionally show up asking for access. And in laboratories around the world, geneticists continue to study the data from the children's DNA, trying to understand the mechanisms that created this phenomenon, trying to determine if this could happen again in other families, trying to predict if there will be more dvojduša born as humans. Genetics become more complex and more deliberate. Some of these geneticists see the children as a warning that we are manipulating human genetics in ways that can have unexpected consequences. Others see them as proof that human consciousness is more flexible and adaptive than we ever imagined, capable of manifesting in forms that we haven't encountered before. What happened in Săpânța when twins married twins may be a genetic miracle, a demonstration that human consciousness can exist in distributed forms that transcend individual bodies. Or it may be a nightmare, a warning about genetic combinations that create beings who can never fully participate in human society as it currently exists. Perhaps it is both simultaneously, a demonstration that the categories of miracle and nightmare are inadequate for describing realities that exist beyond our normal experience and understanding. Realities where the fundamental nature of human identity itself is called into question and transformed into something we are only beginning to recognize and still struggle to accept.